Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been tasted for years.
Here we go, Quintinshill. It was the worst rail crash ever, still is the worst rail crash ever, and it occurred in May of 1915. And the story is really in three bits. So there's the first bit, which was pre-crash. And just to give you a little bit of background, there was a ship, there was the overloaded railway, and there were the needs of the war. And those three things conspired together to actually bring about this disaster. And there's the ship, the Aquitania, which was the second largest liner at the time. It had been requisitioned to take troops to Gallipoli. So a large number of men, it took about 3,000 passengers and 1,000 crew, so it was a pretty large vessel. It was going to come out of Liverpool, it was going to sail through the Irish Sea, down across the Atlantic, into the Med, across to Mudros, and then into Gallipoli. And what happened was that it ran aground. And it ran aground just outside a place called Sandon Dock in Liverpool. And I read about this in the book by Richards and Searle, the Quintinshill's Conspiracy. And they mentioned this, and they said it was in the 7th Royal Scots Records, which it is, that they were due to travel on the Wednesday. They then got a message to say the ship they were travelling in had run aground at Liverpool, and their delay was put back until the Saturday. So they were left sitting, kicking their heels for a couple of days in Edinburgh. Meanwhile, they were trying to get the ship off. Now, this is the only reference I've been able to find to it in the Aberdeen Evening Telegraph. And I even got in touch through friends with the Mersey History Group, who know everything there is ever to know about the River Mersey, except they hadn't heard of this. And they also hadn't heard that the Cape of Good Hope sailed 3 days later. So they began to look a little deeper, and the conclusion we came to was D notices. And that under Dora, the press was muffled, and this was one of the things that was stamped down on. And when you think about it, it's quite sensible, because you wouldn't want to be listing, you know, Aquitania departs Liverpool for Gallipoli, whilst there's a U-boat sitting in the middle of the Irish Sea just waiting to pick it off. So the troop movements out of Liverpool obviously weren't listed in the sailing shippings from Liverpool dock, and the incident involving the Aquitania wasn't listed either. So what it did do was ran aground on the top of a spring tide. And I know we're a bit far from the sea, but if you've got a spring tide, there's lots of water at one point, no water at the other. It's the biggest tides of the season. So it went on the ground on the top of a spring tide, and then the next 3 or 4 days, the tide was getting lower, so there was very little chance of getting it off. So there it was, stuck, or heading into Sandon Dock, with a southeasterly breeze, which is a bit unusual in Liverpool. They're usually off the west. And all we can assume is that it was winded across and landed on that bank roughly where the arrow is, and then had to dredge, pull, tug, and then it was 3 or 4 days before they could actually get it into a dock to check whether it had sprung a plate or 2 or 3. And in fact, there was slight damage to the ship. So that was the Aquitania's part in it, and the fact that the troops who thought they were leaving on Wednesday were now leaving very early on the Saturday morning. We then come to the trains, and the War Department had in the War Book established the priority of trains during conflict. So the top priority, and the railway companies had to negotiate and agree to this, was, and they were able to keep it, long distance express trains were the top priority. If you were a signalman, you didn't hold up a long distance express train. You made sure everything was out of the way and that went through. Of equal priority were troop trains. So if you had a long distance express train and a troop train, you had to make a call between which one you were going to be worrying about. You then got the local trains, and then you got freight trains, but those that were carrying war materials had a higher priority. Higher priority than what? It didn't actually say, but it had a higher priority. So unfortunately for the line from South Wales up to the west coast of England into the Caledonian area through to Glasgow, there was a regular flow, and I hesitate to say this in a mining area, but the Navy was of the view that Welsh coal was the only coal good enough for firing its boilers. So it brought all its coal, as much as it could, from South Wales, which during normal times wasn't too tricky because they could sail colliers up and down the Irish Sea, bring them into Glasgow. Rosyth was a short train trip, or they could run right the way round to Scapa and refuel the fleet up there. Unfortunately, when you got U-boats sitting in the Irish Sea, it was a bit risky sending colliers with the regularity they had to, so they moved a lot of it onto trains. So there's a lot of train traffic from South Wales up to Scotland with coal for the Navy. And it's the coal trains that feature as well. There was also the parliamentary trains, and these were legal requirements, so that they had to have at least one train a day in each direction, which called at every station, kept a reasonable average speed, and more importantly, was cheap and was comfortable. And I can remember my father saying about a friend of his who used to catch the morning train out of Brighton because it was the cheapest. And he used to be in the office in London for about 7 o'clock in the morning. So this is what they used to do. They used to put the parliamentary train on very early or very late, run it through, and then it was out of the way and they'd carried out their duty. And there's one of those involved as well. So between them, the railways were in something of a confusion with the priorities and the levels of the different routes. So the unfortunate protagonists in this were the 7th Royal Scots, the territorial battalion of the Royal Scots, based in Leith, just outside Edinburgh. As with other TA battalions, territorial battalions, they were listed for coastal protection during the early days of the war, so they were mustered very early on the 5th of August. They were moved out, or preparing to move out to their coastal location. They stayed out just outside Leith for a while, and then in April of 1915 they were joined into the Lowland Division and began training in France, just along the road at Larbert, so just outside Edinburgh to the west. And then on the 7th of May, so just 2 weeks after being told they were going to France, they were then told, oh, by the way, lads, you're going to Gallipoli. We need you over there. So that there was changed. And they were going to depart Liverpool on around about the 19th of May. So the geography, there's Edinburgh, there's Larbert, so they were training just there. The train line runs down through Beatock, which also features in the story. Here's Quintinshill, near the junction of the Glasgow and South West Railway, the Caledonian Railway. They all join up at Carlisle, and then it becomes the Western Railway down the west coast of England. So a lot of rail traffic, a lot of routes, and Carlisle really the hub for the whole thing. So what else was involved? Well, this engine, the Carndine class, was the pride of the Caledonian Railway. If you were driving and you were a top quality driver, then you were often put on the Carndines, the express locos. And they'd got one that had just come out of the St Rolloch's depot at Glasgow, and they wanted to try it. So what they did was they ran it down to Carlisle Light. They then put it onto the local parliamentary train to run that as far as Beatock, and then they were going to take the express from Moffat, put the Carndine on the front and take that up. So it had to be at Beatock at the right time to meet the train from Moffat. So that was a bit of a priority that morning as well. The other engines involved, these were the workhorses of the Caledonian, the Type 43s. And two of these were double heading on a Glasgow Express. The third was on the freight train in the loop, which we'll come to in a minute. And the fourth was pulling the troop train. So they were the ones that most were used on the line. So they were good stock, they were good quality, top of the range, particularly the Carndine, but reliable, well tested. The slight problem came when they tried to find rolling stock, and the pressures were such that they were beginning to pull out rolling stock that was 50, 60 years old. And one of the things they had were these Grand Central Railway 6-wheel wooden carriages. And the troop train was made up of 15 of those, which they borrowed. They had wooden frames, they had timber panels, they were on a steel chassis, so the chassis was fairly solid, but the rest of it was flimsy. They'd been painted fairly regularly over the last 50 years, so they'd got a build-up of paint. The wood was dry, and just to make things more interesting or more tragic, they were lit by gas, and the gas was held in cylinders underneath the carriage. And when you wanted the lights on, you just lit the gas in your compartment or in your part of the carriage. They also had on the train 6 luggage vans at the back, loaded with military equipment and ammunition. So not a good combination to take into a crash situation. And the total weight was about 400 tons, but unlike the most modern trains at the time, they only had vacuum brakes, and vacuum brakes work okay-ish as long as there aren't any holes in the pipework and the vacuum is working fully. And there was no guarantee. And over about 40 miles an hour, they were quite difficult to pull up. So you'd got modern engines pulling very ancient stock. You'd got a driver called Francis Scott, who was one of the most skilled men on the Caledonian. He'd driven the trains carrying individually 3 monarchs. He'd driven the royal train with Queen Victoria on, he'd carried the royal train with Edward VII, and he'd driven the royal train with George V. So no fool when it comes to driving and driving safely. And he was a Carlisle man, and he was accompanied on the footplate by his fireman, another Carlisle man called James Hanna. And these two were a pretty regular crew and knew what they were doing and usually got to the right place at the right time. So moving in, so we then come to the little problem of the timetables, the fact that you had 5 trains to juggle and only 4 tracks to play with, and you had a signalman who overslept. So these are the next 3 elements within the story. So on a usual day, on a Saturday, Quintinshill had the 5:15 northbound freight coming through, so that was fine. That would come down from Kirkpatrick, go through to Gretna, and then on to the depot at Kings Hill at Carlisle. Come up from the Carlisle depot and heading north. Then at 6 o'clock, the new signalman came on and changed over, and they briefed each other about what had passed, what was coming, where they were. And at 6:05, the London to Edinburgh, Aberdeen sleeper came through. And then at 6:20, you had the London to Glasgow Express. And then at 6:30 you had the little local parliamentary train that chugged its way up to Beatuck. So it worked absolutely fine. It was a piece of cake. However, on the 22nd of May, it had a 4:30 southbound freight going to Kingshill. And then at 5:10, Meakin, George Meakin, who was the signalman on duty at the time, was telephoned to say that Kingshill depot is full, and would you please keep any more southbound trains heading for Kingshill on your loop, just at the side of the track. At 6:14, the northbound freight was coming through an hour late. At 6:28, a southbound coal train arrived, one of the Welsh ones coming down from Edinburgh, and so that had to go onto the loop. At 6:29, virtually on time, the local parliamentary train came chugging up the line, and what would usually have happened was that was put onto the other loop so the expresses could go through. Unfortunately, both loops were occupied by now. Then at 6:32, his replacement, a chap called James Tinsley, arrived half an hour late. And then half an hour late again, London to Edinburgh, Aberdeen, London troop train to Larbert, Liverpool was due at 6:49, and at 6:51, London to Glasgow. So an awful lot of traffic in a very short time with your replacement arriving late. However, it must be said that that was by agreement, as we'll see. So if we wind back to the previous evening, at Euston Station, the 11:45 Edinburgh Aberdeen via Carlisle is held up, and anybody who travels now on the West Coast main line is well used to any train from Euston being held up. So it was no different then. And the midnight sleeper was also held up. So both trains leave about half an hour late and head north into the night to try and catch up on the time they'd lost. At 3:40, half the battalion of the 7th Royal Scots leaves for Liverpool on the troop train. They stop at Carstairs to take on water because the weight of the train was causing the engine to use more water than usual. So they had to stop at Carstairs to pick up more water. And then at 5:50, the northbound freight left an hour late. So you've got two expresses half an hour late. You've got a troop train on some sort of dodgy timetable that nobody really knows when it's going to turn up, and a northbound freight train that's already an hour late. But the local little parliamentary train chugs out on time with its posh new blue engine on its way to Beatuck. So that keeps going, keep the story going. So moving up to Carlisle, 8 minutes after the local train goes, the delayed Edinburgh Aberdeen follows it up the track, and 7 minutes later the Glasgow sleeper follows up. So you've now got the parliamentary train, the Aberdeen train and the sleeper all chasing each other up the track towards Quintinshill box. So what's the box and the setup like? So that's the layout, and you've got the two main lines, northbound at the top up to Kirkpatrick, signal box about 1.5 miles away, and down south you've got the Gretna box about 1.5 miles away. You've got the two loop lines which are shown, and you've got the signal box, and you've got what's called the crossover. And the crossover, as you might imagine, features in this story because they have to shift trains around a bit. And that's what it looks like now. So on the left and right extremes, you've got your two loop lines. You've got your two main lines, southbound on the left-hand side, northbound on the right. And where the signal box was is shown by the arrow. The crossover has gone. It's actually about half a mile back behind where that photo was taken from. But that's the configuration. So what's going on? So at 6 o'clock, you have the situation where Tinsley, who's overslept, is trying to get to work. But George Meakin, the guy on duty, had realised that the Quintinshill, the local train was going to have to stop at Quintinshill to let the express through. So he rang his mate, or rang the station at Gretna, and said, it's okay, when he turns up, he lived in the cottages next door. When he turns up, tell him he can hitch a ride on the train and come up on the local train, which wouldn't get there till past. But they'd done it before. They'd done it quite often. It was fairly well known. They had a routine. Then at 6:14, they've tucked the northbound goods train from Kingmore, which has arrived, onto the top loop, the northern loop. Tinsley is waiting at Gretna for his train, and everything seems quite okay. At 28 past, you've got the situation where the Welsh train's arrived and they've put it on the south loop, so that's both loops full. The local train's now left Gretna with Tinsley on the footplate, and the London to Edinburgh and the Aberdeen are just north of Carlisle. So you've got two expresses heading north, following the local train, carrying your relief signalman. A minute later, the local train arrives from Carlisle, and Tinsley hops off, climbs up into the box, and starts talking to Meakin. And the Glasgow train is now just a mile and a half south at Gretna, and the troop train is about 19-20 miles away, doing 70 miles an hour with that stock on it. And the troops writing about it afterwards and recalling the events talked about the way that their kit was just bouncing around, they were just bouncing around, and it was frankly quite terrifying. They were just waiting for something to happen at that speed. But Scott and Hannah had to be on time. They knew what their schedule was. They were trying to catch up. They'd done this line 100 times before and felt quite confident that they'd be able to get through and manage it. So 3 or 4 minutes later, you're moving the local train to let the two expresses through using the loop. And you tuck it up, and eventually it's tucked up just outside the signal box, just behind the southbound coal train. Now, one of the rules is that the guard of any train that stopped either in a siding or on a loop or on a main line has to go to the signal box and has to report his position to the signalman and has to sign the logbook to say, under Rule 55, that he is reporting his train and it is being cared for. And the two guards of the coal train and the local train and of the the northbound goods train all went up and reported in. Unfortunately, the process was that when you were going to be late for your shift, at 6 o'clock, your mate started writing down everything that was happening, all the signals, all the passing trains, on a scrap of paper. And when you arrived at 6 o'clock, or when Tinsley arrived at 6 o'clock, he then started to fill in the official logbook. So he was occupied in the corner writing the logbook whilst all this was happening outside. And the story was that George Meakin was sat in the corner reading the paper, waiting to go home. You had a succession of guards coming in to report their trains, and Tinsley was just saying, well, yeah, just sign the book, or it'll be about there. And it turned out that two of them had signed in the wrong place in the end. And then there was two versions of the event. One was that they stayed and talked around about chickens, and the other version was that they actually went back to their trains as required, and it's not quite sure which is correct. So you've got all this going on. You've got the train's parked up. The Gretna has telegraphed to Quintinshill, train approaching. Tinsley responded correctly, yeah, fine, line's clear, you can come through, going north, absolutely fine. So the Edinburgh-Aberdeen Express comes through, everybody's sitting there. Troop train by now is about 10 minutes away up the track, but the local train is still sitting in its way. 3 minutes later, you've got the Glasgow sleeper, 10 minutes down the line, crossing the border just south of Gretna. You've got the troop train now about 7 minutes away, and you've still got the local train sitting on the southbound line, pointing in the wrong direction. 6:46, the Glasgow sleeper passes Gretna. Tinsley accepts from Kirkpatrick Fleming the troop train and says, yep, line clear. Absolutely forgetting that sitting in the middle of the track is the local parliamentary train. And he signals the line clear, and Scott and Hannah on the footplate keep going, plod on, push on to try and make up their lost time. Just as they're rounding the last bend, the fireman, Hannah, notices there's a train parked on the line in front of them. The two guys on the local train in the cab of that engine realise there is a train hurtling towards them, but with its brakes hard on, trying to slow down. So the two on the local train dive out of the cab. Scott and Hannah stay in place, keep working the brakes to the last possible second, crash, and are both instantly killed. They crashed into that local train, so you've got engine on engine, so it's heavyweight against heavyweight. You've got 400 tons of varied assorted and assembled carriages and freight behind the troop train, and it just buckles, and it just runs across. And whilst at the start, the troop train was about 170 yards long, in about 2 seconds, it's down to 67 yards. It's just absolutely concertinaed together. The lads realise that there is a panic on, and the guard of the local train runs back down the track going south, aware that the Glasgow train is about to appear, and he tries to slow that one down. So you've now got 6:52, you've got the troop train scattered across the track, you've got the coal train, you've got the local train pushed backwards, and you've got the Glasgow sleeper frantically putting the brakes on both engines to try and slow down. Unfortunately, across the track, at the back of the troop train, somehow disconnected from everything else, is the tender of the troop train, which is a pretty heavy chunk of metal to run into. And the front of the Glasgow train runs into that and pushes it together. And again, you've got conflagration in the sleeper. And that's the official drawing at the time. So what you've got is the tender of the troop train is there, the engine of the troop train is here, you've got the Glasgow Express spread across there, you've got the troop train scattered down here, you've got the coal train down on there. So a real disaster. And what's going on? Tinsley kind of wakes up and says more or less what happened. Hannah, Scott and Hannah are both dead, and the whole thing catches fire. And what you've got is the gas cylinders underneath the troop train. You've got gas cylinders underneath some of the sleeper carriages, and the whole lot just goes up because there's quite a lot of hot coal flying around, and it just causes that conflagration. And up it goes. And that's what's left of the tender. That's the saloon. And that's the engines, the goods train engine. So, absolute carnage. So, what do we do about it? So, the crash happened at about 8 minutes to 7 the soldiers, the ones who had survived, managed to get to the Caledonian carriages at the end of the train and manually pull back or push back the freight carriages carrying the ammunition and their equipment. So fortunately they got that out of the way. There were 11 fire extinguishers between the 4 trains. The soldiers and crew tried to put what out they could. They tried to use water from the engine tenders, but unfortunately, because 3 of them had had a long journey, they were pretty empty, and the other 2 had been fractured in the crash. So there was very little water going around. And eventually, somebody turned up from the nearby farm with a stirrup pump and a hose. And that's all they had to start actually trying to fight the fire. And there's horrific stories, some apocryphal, about soldiers trapped in the luggage, in the carnage, pleading with their mates to shoot them and so forth. So it was pretty horrible. So the superintendent, the phone line was still working. So Nicol Campbell, who was the superintendent at Carlisle Station, was telephoned and told of the crash. And about an hour after the crash, he left Carlisle with 4 doctors, 15 ambulance men, 12 stretchers and a first aid kit, but failed to tell the fire service. Then, again, another story that is difficult to pin down, but it's been recounted in different angles a few times, was a sailor suddenly appeared at Carlisle police station at about 8 o'clock. Now, the story was that he'd actually hitchhiked to get into Carlisle. He'd gone to the police station, alerted them about the crash, but didn't mention the fire. Now, the chief constable, Eric de Schmidt, was also head of the fire service. So he rang Nicol Campbell's office to be told, he was already on his way. He'd left quarter of an hour before with the rescue train. So de Schmidt decided that he'd probably better get himself up to Carlisle and mentioned to the fire service that there was something going on they needed to know about. Somehow they'd heard about it, because by the time de Schmidt got there, round about 10 o'clock, the fire brigade was already there, but all they had as a water supply was a tiny little beck, the Black Sark River, which is a tiny little stream, as the only source, and that was about a quarter of a mile away. And they didn't have what they call pumps on the engines then that were very powerful to actually draw the water very far. So they were struggling. So really awful. Just an aside about de Schmidt. You might have noticed that it's a slightly Germanic name. And at one point he was walking through Carlisle, and young boys would stand and say, "Look at the Kaiser, look at the Kaiser." And in 1916, his name suddenly became Spence. And he was one of the number in Carlisle of German origin who changed their name. But he was generally a good guy. So what began to happen? So you began to get local people had heard there was something happening on their bikes, turned up out of Gretna from the local farms. They got 11 doctors from Carlisle, some more from Longton, and some arrived from as far away as Penrith by about noon. And there was a story again of Dr. Edwards, who's a surgeon at Carlisle, having to perform amputations to actually get men out from underneath the carriages and drag them clear. The train carriages that were left at the back of the express were still on the track, so they sent an engine up from Carlisle and used that, turned it round, sent it south as the first ambulance train down to the Carlisle hospital. And that got to there about quarter to 11 o'clock. So there'd been 4 hours after the crash, the first casualties begin to appear at the Cumberland Infirmary. And there were 2 more trains after that. The Citizens League, which had been established in Carlisle, was, as its name suggests, a group of citizens who got together to do things, a bit like the civil defence, to do things as necessary as the war demanded. And one thing they had been doing was picking up troops from ambulance trains to take them into Carlisle Infirmary in their cars or vans or whatever they had handy. So they were quite used to going to the station and picking up casualties and carrying them to the hospital. Also what had been done was they'd put a siding up to the Carr's biscuit factory, which was next to the hospital, and they began to use that to park ambulance trains in there. So a couple of the trains were moved straight up to the infirmary and the casualties offloaded. By noon, Carlisle Hospital had dealt with 180 cases, which was pretty hard work. The local hospitals then joined in, and they'd got a couple of convalescent hospitals, the Chadwick, and the Chadwick said, yes, we've got some men who could be partially discharged. So local hotels chipped in. They took some of the casualties from the Chadwick. The local vicar took 4. Other people put 4 up in their house. They cleared some beds. And then others were put on trains to go down to either back up to Glasgow using the Glasgow and South Western line, or down to Penrith, Preston, or even as far as Liverpool, depending on where there was space in hospitals. The trouble was that they knew, the Citizens League knew, that there were going to be people coming from Edinburgh saying, where's our Charlie? Or where's our Charlie? Where's he gone? So the Citizens League was very quick in creating a list of who people were, where they were, and how to get to them. And they drew up this list. As the trains began to come in from Edinburgh later on, they met the people, escorted them to wherever they were having to go, and helped them on their way. So the scene back at the crash, pretty horrific. You've got the bodies laid out, you've got the casualties laid out. They used a barn just across the field as a temporary mortuary, and one of the Citizens League spent the day driving his car around, literally carrying bodies to the mortuary. Another one spent the day ferrying bandages from Carlisle to Quintinshill and then going back for more to keep the stocks going. So a lot went through. The Caledonian Railway had its own ambulance train, which they'd been showing off in Carlisle, and they brought that in and used that to carry some of the casualties back on one of the later trains. But the whole thing, and you can see there some of the coal trucks on the right, and the train on the left, and the broken gun that the chap's holding just on the right there is just showing the damage to a rifle that was probably on a rack in one of the carriages. And the sleeping car, 3 people died in the sleeping car, 2 people died on the local train, but most of the casualties came from the train. And there's 1 or 2 fairly famous photos. This one of the troop being roll called at the end of the disaster, and there were only about 50 men left who could actually stand and answer their names of the 498 who'd left Edinburgh a short time before. And then a quite unusual and rare photo that I was lent is the bacon curer who joined in to help carrying the coffins from Carlisle up to the morgue at Quintinshill, and worked that one out. So he was carrying them backwards and forwards. So that's again the routing. You've got the Quintinshill there, you've got Edinburgh, and you've got the east-south line. So the officials of the Caledonian Railway were quickly on a train from Glasgow down to use the Glasgow and South Western line to get into Carlisle to see what was going on. So what happened to the lads in the train? So the other half of the battalion had been diverted and came in on the Western line through Dumfries, down the Glasgow South West line, missed everything, got to Carlisle and carried on to get down to Liverpool to catch their boat for Gallipoli. The survivors were first put on the task of sorting any equipment salvaged from the disaster. And again, horrific tales of that. But then they were then put on another train and sent to Liverpool, arriving about 3 o'clock the following morning. So they'd been in one crash, had to sort out the debris, put on a train, shifted overnight on a train that was travelling quite quickly, and they were pretty frightened by now because they didn't like rattling in carriages. They'd done it before. So they were rattled down, they got to Liverpool. They were then put on the Empress of India, which was the replacement troop ship, and it was then realised that they perhaps weren't in the best state to be sent to Gallipoli. So the officers were told that they had to remain, they had to go, but the other ranks were to be returned to Edinburgh, which was fine in theory because they were marched from the dock up to Lime Street Station to catch the train, and the scallies of Liverpool then decided that since they were so scruffy, so tired and so worn out, they were obviously prisoners of war, so were less than polite about their greetings to them as they passed through the city. They were then put back on another train, and they got back to Edinburgh about 10 o'clock on the Sunday night, when they were forbidden to talk to anybody, but were put in Craigleith Hospital to rest. So at least 62 hours after the crash, they were at least being looked after. And any relatives were taken by special train down to Carlisle and then on to Penrith or Preston. 25th of May, the inquest opened in Carlisle. The coroner, local solicitor, Thomas Strong, was saying how difficult it was because the accident had occurred in Scotland and was therefore under Scots jurisdiction, but a number of the casualties had died in hospital in Carlisle and were therefore under English jurisdiction. So they were having to sort that one out, but they had to be clear about who was dealing with what. Tinsley, in a preliminary hearing, said to the coroner, "I forgot about the local train." And that's a recurring line that keeps coming through. And on the 26th of May, you had the Scott and Hannah funerals in Carlisle, which were pretty grand affairs, with the great and the good of the city and the great and the good of the Caledonian Railway turning out for these two well-respected, brave guys who died in such a tragic way. And even some of the survivors outside the Chadwick were drawn up to pay their respects as the cortege went past, because the two lads lived not far from the hospital. So, moving on to Act 3. So we've now got a coroner's inquest, a Board of Trade inquiry, and a court case. So, was there a cover-up? And this is where Richardson Searle's book, The Quintinshill Conspiracy, comes to its fore, and also the film, the BBC film that was put together on a very similar theme. It's kind of questionable. Historians are of the view that since Richards was a journalist, the book is of a journalistic standard, rather than necessarily being of a full historical research. But it's nevertheless a well-crafted account with probably some facts within it. Evidence came in three directions. There was the Caledonian Railway's own inquiry, there was the Board of Trade inquiry, and there was the trial of Tinsley, Meakin and Hutchinson, who was the guard on the goods train, because he was the one in the signal box at the time. So, what should have happened was to move the local train onto the southbound line. George Meakin should have called Kirkpatrick to say block back. In other words, put the signal down, stop any train passing your box to enter the section between Kirkpatrick and Quintinshill. But he couldn't do that because he had the coal train still going onto the loop. And until it was parked in the loop, he couldn't actually put a block back on because he couldn't close his section because there was a train in it. Catch-22. He could have fitted a signal collar onto the lever controlling the southbound signals and stopped them being set to clear. And the guard should have checked that he'd done it, Rule 55. But under the Caledonian Railway, apparently, that never ever happened. It was one of those rules that was more in the breach than in the practice. He didn't. Meakin should have briefed his relief. This is what's going on. I've had these through. These are coming. You can expect these. This is what we're having. And the brakesman said that Meakin did brief Tinsley, and Tinsley immediately began to fill in the movement record for the past half hour using the notes that Meakin had provided him with. So that's the story of what should and didn't and did and might have and perhaps happened. So the Procurator Fiscal on the Scots side wrote statements and sent them to the Crown Office in Edinburgh. The Carlisle Coroner's inquest opened and adjourned, and on the same day the Board of Trade inquiry in Carlisle began as well. So again, lots of inquiry. The inquiry chairman and the coroner visited the site, saw what had happened, and saw some of the wreckage and the layout of the tracks. On the 28th of May, police were sent from Dumfries, probably in response to the fiscal's statement to the Crown Office. The police were sent from Dumfries to Gretna to arrest Tinsley. Clearly, I didn't see the train was culpable. In fact, what happened was, and this is the transcript of a telephone message from Dumfries, that when the constables went to apprehend him, they found him unwell. His own doctor said he'd suffered from epilepsy since the accident. And Richards and Searle make quite a lot of the fact that probably you don't just suddenly start suffering from epilepsy. They put the theory in that he had suffered from this for a while. So what they then said was that he could only be removed by ambulance, that the Scots would send their own doctor, an independent doctor, down to assess him and then move him to Dumfries if he was fit to travel. In fact, what happened was that the ambulance arrived at Gretna at 1:45. Tinsley was examined by Dr. Ross, and he arrived at Dumfries by 3 o'clock. It's a 25-mile journey over a road which wasn't tarmacked. So the ambulance was either bouncing a lot or it wasn't, the cursory examination took place. And then 2 days later, Tinsley was released on £300 bail. And again, the question emerges of where does a bloke like Tinsley suddenly find 300 quid from to pay his bail or to stand his bail? This photo is of the men who were driving the other trains, and they turned up to talk at the inquiry and the coronary report in Carlisle. The Board of Trade inquiry, the NUR, National Union of Railmen, briefed 2 local solicitors, but Jimmy Thomas, the MP who was the secretary of the National Union, took personal charge of establishing the support, so took a huge interest in the case and was quite significant in the trial. There were 19 witnesses. The focus was on the irregularity of the shift system at Quintinshill. In other words, if you're going to be half an hour late, we've got a way to deal with it. The limited use of lever covers on the Caledonian railways in general, The Caledonian evidence focused on the disregard of regulation by the railmen. It's here, black and white, Rule 55, this is what you're supposed to do. They didn't do it, it's their fault. But there'd been 3 inspection visits to the Quintinshill box by the station master of Gretna and by a district inspector. So it's a bit odd to have 3 inspections. So were there suspicions that things weren't quite run properly at the Quintinshill box that they were trying to catch out from? And one of the inspections was at 3 o'clock in the morning and another one at 9:20, but they missed the 6 o'clock shift change to see what happened there. But there were possibly suspicions. So what happened? The immediate response was that Thorburn, the station master at Gretna, who was responsible for the supervision, was removed from his job on the main line. Meakin was imprisoned for 18 months after a fairly brisk trial in Edinburgh, and Tinsley got 3 years. That's Tinsley in prison at Peterhead. And he writes, whilst he's there, writing to ask if you will kindly consider my case of the accident at Quintinshill. As I told them at the border trailly, the truth was I forgot all about the local train. I would have willingly laid down my life for those fine men. I want somebody to help me get over the accident. I'm praying to God for my wife and 3 children. All have pity on us, bring us all together again. And I'm quite willing, if fit, to serve my king and country. So he was kind of throwing himself on the mercy of anybody. He was well behaved in prison, and in fact, he went to see his father at Ripon, who'd suffered a stroke, and the prison officer who escorted him from Peterhead down to Ripon, which was quite lenient, one thinks, reported on his good behaviour. So what happened to these 3 blokes? So Thorburn was removed from the main line, and he became station master at Biggar. Meakin, who was jailed on the 15th of September, was 18 months, was out within 15 months. And Tinsley, who had been imprisoned on the same date for 3 years, was out on the 15th of September 1916 as well. So suddenly, the 2 protagonists were released from jail. Meakin was re-employed as a second man on a guards van. So not a signalman anymore, but at least still employed by the railway. Tinsley, whilst he was in prison, his wife got a job with the Caledonian Railway in the cloakroom at Carlisle, and continued to live in the Caledonian house in Carlisle instead of the one at Gretna that she'd had. So they looked after her and the 3 children. And after release, Tinsley was taken on as a lampman and later a porter at Carlisle. So again, the 2 protagonists looked after, and again, Richards and Searle make quite a lot of this in terms of, this is clearly part of the deal that we'll look after you guys if you take the rap. I was reading a website recently involving railmen, and they said at the time the railway companies were a family, and you didn't let down members of your family. So if somebody was dismissed, unless it was for something pretty illegal, you still looked after them. So possibly giving a job as a second guardsman or as a lampsman was just the Caledonian Railway looking after the family. Who knows? Again, opportunity for speculation. There were other questions at the time about why these guys weren't immediately whipped into the army to at least make 2 replacements for the ones that had been killed in the crash. But in fact, under the terms of the Military Service Acts and the various ones that followed, both railway guards, Meakin, and lampmen, Tinsley, were exempt from military service because their service on the railway was necessary. And then in 1917, that was changed ever so slightly because it was then that the railway companies could decide for themselves which men had to be retained. So they just kept them on. So Richards and Searle, they pick out the confusing directives and the priority of trains. And we saw that at the beginning, didn't we? You know, which one do you let through first? Who put the responsibility on the signalman? You know, why couldn't somebody at Carlisle have taken a strategic decision to say there's going to be a problem up ahead, what can we do about it? But it was left to the lowly signalman on the spot at the time to do the job. Was Tinsley subject to epileptic fits? His doctor said he'd started them since the crash, had they had them before. In which case, he should never have been given a job as a signalman in the first place. Was the supervision adequate? Probably not, because Thorburn was moved on. The use of signal collards not used. That was pretty traditional. Again, needs picking up. But the Board of Trade inquiry was written on Caledonian headed notepaper, which they did think was a little suspicious in terms of who'd actually written the report. And there was the case of the old and dangerous stock, but that was pretty rife across the whole system. So this is the Board of Trade inquiry. I couldn't actually copy the actual thing, but it is on Caledonian headed paper. And Druitt, the former Royal Engineers officer who was the Board of Trade officer, was pretty inexperienced at carrying out inquiries. And again, Richards and Searle say this was part of the conspiracy, put somebody in who won't question too deeply. And what they're saying is that with regard to the action taken, I understand some of the principal companies are carrying out the recommendations. I mean, this sounds so familiar, you know, we've learnt our lessons. So they're carrying out the recommendations about carriage construction. Most of the practical companies are providing electric light in new carriages. Nothing said about the old stock they're still using. And the express trains are, I believe, provided with tools and appliances for extinguishing fire. So a little bit of a cover-up there, and not a very satisfactory outcome in terms of what should be finished. So was there a cover-up? It was expedient for the Caledonian Railway to strike the deal, and I forgot about the local train. I'll take the rap, you look after us. There was some compensation paid to Mrs. Scott and Mrs. Hannah, so that you got about equivalent of 25,500 invested for Mrs. Scott and the children, and a weekly allowance, and a slightly smaller amount for Mary Hannah and her one child. So the Caledonian Railway stumped up for the two innocent driver and fireman on the troop train. I can only find one example of one of the protagonists being compensated, and he got £125 plus expenses for his pretty horrific injuries of the damaged bones and severe burns. Whatever happened, you still got 214 members of the Royal Scots in Rosebank Cemetery. Many others received injuries. 8 people died on the Glasgow train. A mother and baby were killed on the local train, and Scott and Hannah were firmly buried in Stanwick Cemetery in Carlisle. And the Roseburg Bank Memorial still stands and is visited on the date of the accident, as is the plaque which is on the bridge above the Quintinshill line at the point where the accident occurred. Tragic event. Was there a cover-up? Pretty horrible, certainly for those involved, but talk about a chapter of accidents waiting to happen. It was a real coming together of happenstance that actually caused the Quintinshill crash. Thank you.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Inky, pinky, parlez-vous? Out on Kinky